it just becomes another excuse not to accommodate disability when you just say, oh, autism is a superpower. Like, we haven't actually moved anywhere from that child having no support.
The word neurodiversity is showing up more and more in classrooms, therapy offices, and advocacy circles. But what does it actually mean? And what's the problem with feel-good labels like superpower? Emily Paige Ballou is a writer, educator, and autistic advocate who brings a sharp, thoughtful lens to these questions. We're talking about the real meaning of neurodiversity, how ableism can show up in even the most well-intentioned spaces, and why this movement is about so much more than just inclusion. That's straight ahead on episode 274. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Summer always makes space for reflection in a way that the school year just doesn't. The pace slows down, the noise quiets, and we finally get a moment to ask ourselves the bigger questions. What worked? What didn't? What do I want to do differently next year? If you've been thinking about how to better support your neurodivergent students, or how to bring more inclusive strengths-based practices into your classroom, the Educator Hub is a great place to start, or restart. The doors are open right now, and it's the perfect time to dive in, explore the resources, and shift your mindset before the next wave of initiatives, meetings, and staff memos start rolling in. Click the link in the show notes or head to neurodiversity.university and click on the link for the Educator Hub to join us. Okay, my conversation with Emily is here in a minute.
previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Maybe your kid's not going to sign up for the baseball team or go to birthday parties because those are wildly overwhelming and out of their comfort zone. Maybe the kinesthetic stuff is really tough. Dropping a neurodivergent kid off at a birthday party who needs something really concrete, that is the antithesis of that. But being in a virtual Dungeons and Dragons program where I have a role, I know who I am, I can be an avatar, someone that has traits that I aspire to be, that is really attractive. And that might build more confidence. It might help me find people. And maybe anecdotally we're sharing stories and I find something that the real human me, not my avatar, has a connection with that person, and then we kind of hit it off that way. A big part of us has to just let go, ask ourselves why. We have to ask, what are we hoping for? And let go of the how.
That's episode 250. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm talking with Emily Paige Ballou. Emily is an AEA stage manager based in New York City, where she specializes in new plays and musicals, but her work extends far beyond the theater. She's also the co-editor of Sincerely Your Autistic Child, a powerful collection of essays that share insights from autistic individuals on identity, acceptance, and growing up. If you've ever read her writing on The Thinking Person's Guide to Autism or her reflections on her blog, you'll know how thoughtful and clear-eyed she is when it comes to talking about the neurodiversity movement, not just about the language, but the deeper values behind it. Emily brings a grounded and thoughtful voice to conversations that can often feel muddled or misunderstood, and she's not afraid to challenge popular narratives. And while she's now based in New York, she's originally from Missouri. Emily, thank you for joining me.
You're so welcome.
Let's start with a foundation.
Sure.
Because I think this is where a lot of confusion begins. In so many spaces, therapy offices, even advocacy work, I hear people using the word neurodiversity, but not always in a way that lines up with how it was originally meant. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it becomes a kind of catch-all for anything related to brain-based differences, and other times people use it as a softer stand-in for disability, like it's somehow more palatable in that way, or sometimes even it's just a stand-in for quirky. When you think about how the term neurodiversity is being used in mainstream conversations right now, what do you wish people understood more clearly?
I do wish that people had a firmer sense of the concept of neurodiversity as having been based around the biological concept of biodiversity, which was this concept kind of pioneered by the biologist E.O. Wilson, if I'm remembering correctly, that, was about the ways that the survival of an entire ecosystem is in the interconnections between everything in it, and not just in discrete species. So the neurodiversity movement posited a lot of the brain-based differences that traditionally have been thought of as pathological or as disorders as parts of an ecosystem of human minds, and that a healthy human society actually needs people with lots of kinds of minds, including ones that are hard to understand or that operate kind of outside of what's conventionally considered normal. And, to your point, these days I see a lot of neurodiversity being used as a euphemism to avoid talking about disability. And I see people both doing this and then getting the mistaken impression that that's what neurodiversity is supposed to be about, is that we just don't talk about disability anymore.
Yeah, I think sometimes people feel like it feels safer to talk about it in that context.
Yes. And this goes back to, I don't think you can really talk about the values behind neurodiversity without being very comfortable talking about disability as inherent to human diversity, in fact. A dynamic that I see a lot is when we talk about things like autism or ADHD being intrinsic to human diversity, and then people will say, so you don't really see those things as disabilities. And it's that actually we see disability as intrinsic to human diversity. In a big enough range of functionality or diversity, some of those modes of operation are going to be disabling.
I think you pegged it there, the fact that those two ideas are not mutually exclusive.
Yes.
It kind of gets into this idea that I want to talk about that comes up a lot when I work with families or schools, and that's this idea that neurodivergence is a superpower.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is often meant as encouragement.
Yeah.
And I get that impulse. And to be fair, I recognize that there are pieces of my own neurodivergence that truly are strengths. I do believe that.
Sure.
But it's kind of this swinging of the pendulum from one extreme to the other.
Yes.
Where when we look at it that way, it's like people are really only valued for those exceptional traits.
Yes.
And ignoring the disability. So how do you think that this superpower framing impacts how neurodivergent people are seen more broadly, and maybe also how they are then supported?
I think it causes this just snapback to people can't only be acceptable to the extent that our neurodivergence is not disabling. To go back to the biodiversity model, in the natural world, organisms have traits, and especially when, new mutations arise, that can be advantageous in one circumstance and disadvantageous in another circumstance. Nature isn't making value judgments about those things. And I wish we had a better understanding of autism and neurodivergence, in that, so many of the aspects of autism, for instance, that make it disabling can be advantageous in certain circumstances and absolutely represent strengths in certain circumstances. But all of them are kind of double-edged swords. And so, they're going to feel like a superpower on some days. I don't think we can ever eliminate the flip side, that in other circumstances, those same things that feel like superpowers are going to feel disabling. And I don't feel like it is fair to ask people, and to ask kids especially, to divide themselves like that. The very same condition or state of being that does give you these really unique perceptual strengths and abilities. To have that, you have to also support the disability on the flip side of it.
Right. And so what I hear you saying is, if you want those quote unquote superpowers to be able to do the wonderful things that they might be able to do, we have to then also provide the scaffolding, provide the support provide the tools on the other side, because otherwise there's this suppression of what those skills might even be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so you wind up again, it just becomes another excuse not to accommodate disability when you just say, oh, autism is a superpower. Like we haven't actually moved anywhere from that child having no support.
Yeah.
And also, I think this is a lot of what happened to autistic people in the world of my generation and older, that, there's a lot of discourse going around now about why we didn't used to see so many autistic people in the world. And it's common to say, well, they were all just institutionalized. And part of the problem is that's not quite true. Most of us weren't diagnosed or identified. And so people who were getting by in the world with no support were just using all of their intelligence, all of their capability, all of their, resources and adaptability just to survive and just to get by. Mm-hmm. And some of them, nevertheless, led incredibly creative and influential lives. But I think so many more people with their disabilities more properly supported could have led more sustainable lives.
The topic that we're kind of dancing around as we talk about this is this idea of the social model of disability.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is? Because I suspect that there are a lot of people who've never even heard of it.
Yeah. So the social model of disability, it was pioneered by physically disabled people in the United Kingdom, again, if I'm recalling correctly. And I do just want to be clear that I think the social model of disability is an incredibly important and influential framework that's given us a lot. I just feel like I have always found it not wholly satisfying when it comes to autism and neurodivergent conditions. But the social model says basically that, human bodies can be impaired in all kinds of ways. So, for instance, if somebody is paralyzed below the waist and uses a wheelchair, that's an impairment. They can't walk. What is disabling is their exclusion from society by social and material architecture. And that those things can be alleviated. You can't cure or eliminate an impairment necessarily, but that somebody can, become less disabled or not disabled. Again, and I find this a very important way to think. And I certainly think that society could do a better job of being less disabling to autistic and neurodivergent people. And I'm speaking personally here a little bit. So many of the things that I find disabling about autism, I struggle to think that that any amount of societal architecture could perfectly obviate those things. Mm-hmm. One of the things I struggle a whole lot with is inertia. The ability to change movements, to switch tasks, to, move between activities. And as much as we can destigmatize that and accommodate for that in society, that's an amount of energy that I am always going to be putting into fighting a little bit more than other people are. And again, I don't say this to say that the social model has nothing to do with or nothing to say about neurodivergence, but I find it a little bit less neatly satisfying than I can see it being the case for more physical disabilities.
An example that I use when I'm talking about this with groups is I'll talk about the stereotypical example of eye contact with autism, which, again, not that means all.
Sure.
And that's one that people are familiar with. And I often say I would not necessarily call difficulty making eye contact an impairment. I would say it's a difference, but it becomes disabling when somebody can't get a job because they go to an interview.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's a societal construct there. But I agree with you completely that I think it's a good framework. I think it's a good thought experiment to consider,
yes,
especially as we're looking at accommodations and trying to figure out what could we do to provide supports.
When we talk about neurodiversity, and one of the things I've seen happening I think you mentioned is it tends to get conflated with this social model of disability, that what we're saying is that autism isn't really disabling, society is disabling. And again, in some ways, that is true. But I think we're saying something else and something subtly deeper in neurodiversity. So for instance, again, going back to inertia, yes, I find this disabling in ways that I don't think society can ever perfectly accommodate for. But also, that's a feature of autism that also contributes to modes of thinking that I find very valuable, and experiences that I also find very valuable. This thing that is undoubtedly disabling also contributes to the ability to stay with one task for a long, long time, or to stay obsessed with a topic for a long, long time, or to, feel yourself as very deeply connected to a place where you are, or to nature, or to things like that, or to, having to think about economies of movement. And those are all modes of thought and modes of creativity, again, that I think are valuable to society and valuable to the human ecosystem.
You've also pointed out that some identity-related statements that seem empowering on the surface can actually be a little more complicated. So one example that I've seen you give is when people say autistic individuals are more likely to identify as LGBTQIA+ because they're more honest, or they're less bound by social norms. That's something that I've seen shared widely and even repeated in professional settings, but it always felt a little off. Can you talk about why that explanation might be problematic, even if it's well-meaning?
Sure. To me, it feels like we're just flipping the script on whose sexuality we are considering inherently more honest or inherently more natural. There's been a prejudice for a long, long time that bisexual people, for instance, are more dishonest, more likely to cheat, less sure of who they are, simply not able to make a choice. And I don't think just taking that same prejudice and applying it to a different set of people is actually progress. If we're just saying, no, that's not true for queer people, that's true for non-autistic people, I don't think anybody, probably with rare exceptions, but generally speaking, I don't think anybody is being fundamentally dishonest when they talk about their feelings or their sexuality. I think people across the board are probably formulating experiences in a way that feels meaningful to them and to the data that they have. When we accept this as the explanation, I think it probably also is damaging to our ability to understand why this might actually be true without assigning, moral value to being queer or straight or autistic or non-autistic, which, I don't think should be our goal. Because again, these are value judgments that nature is not making, that humans are making. One of the things that we are coming to know about autism is that we process data differently than non-autistic people. Our brains process about 40% more data when at rest. We tend to process data in a more specific rather than a more general way, and in a more bottom-up rather than top-down manner. I suspect that may actually have consequences for how we are coming to understand our own attractions and our own feelings. Again, not that this has to be something that we have to get to the bottom of, but I think it kind of writes off that this may be something more intrinsic to how our minds and how our feelings work than just that we're characterologically better. Which also I will not be the only or the first person to point out. There's a danger of falling into just Aspie supremacy again, to say, well, autistic people are more straightforward, more honest. This actually highly privileges autistic people who can formulate our thoughts in certain ways, who can express ourselves verbally, who, have had the means even to be involved in queer communities, online or otherwise. I don't find we're just more honest and less bound by societal convention to be a satisfying answer to that. I do think there may be a component where, again, so many of us grow up feeling so marginalized and so lost and like outsiders for so much of our lives before we identified as queer, that then to do that felt like less of a leap and felt like maybe something that wasn't even worth concealing because we already felt like such outsiders. I don't have any problem believing that it's something that might feel easier to be honest about to us because we already have lifetimes worth of experiences of being tagged as an outsider and not being able to help being seen as different. But I doubt whether we actually identify that way more just because we are less bound by societal expectations.
I want to talk about a topic that I know is controversial. I don't know. There's lots of things that are controversial, but this is a specific one, pathological demand avoidance or PDA. And I'm just going to, be very direct as far as saying, we've done episodes on the podcast about PDA and brought people on. And I feel like there is a valuable conversation that is happening in that space. What are some of the critiques about that label and the assumption? And what do you think people are missing when they latch on to that term?
Yeah, so I do want to start by saying that when people talk about the experiences that they or their kids are having that get labeled as PDA, I think that those experiences are incredibly real. I think that they are observing and feeling absolutely real things. I think that to give those experiences the PDA label is obscuring more than it is actually illuminating about why those things are occurring and what their root is. And it goes back a little bit to calling autism a superpower in that, like, on the surface, I absolutely understand why that label and why that description can seem very, very explanatory. But I think the consequence is that we are not looking at the deeper reasons why those experiences are occurring and what we can best do to support those people. I think what people are largely missing, and again, I don't know everything here. And so I'm not saying there's nothing that I could be missing, but I think that most of the components underlying experiences of PDA are things that we already know about autism. It doesn't occur exclusively in autistic children, but I think that virtually everything we need to know, we already know about experiences of neurodivergent kids. And about autism. I don't think it helps us just to have another set of words to say some autistic people just won't do what they're supposed to do. And especially autistic girls just won't do what they're told.
Right.
And, when people say, no, you don't understand, it's very, very basic things that I can't do even if I want to do. But having day-to-day trouble with very, very basic tasks, even if you want to do them, is already something that is inherent in the definition of autism.
Right.
And so I think there's a danger of denying what the underlying disability is in these people's inability to do things in the face of demand or do things, even if they want to do them. Like I suspect there may be mechanisms underlying why demands can create additional barriers that aren't being addressed if we just say, this is a presentation of autism where, having something asked of you means that you can't do it. There's mechanisms underlying that, and I think going back to some of the things we already know about autism with regard to, for instance, inertia and motor planning difficulty and multitasking difficulty would go a long way towards explaining some of those experiences in less stigmatizing ways that just, in my view, paint kids as defiant for no reason, which is a stigma and a prejudice about autism that we already have.
I think it just gets complicated, and I understand the desire for people to have a shorthand to explain what's going on.
Absolutely.
Here's really where my concern with it more than anything comes from, is that I often get caught in the disconnect between the neurodiversity community and the world that I live in as a professional supporting neurodivergent people.
Yeah.
For example, this is not necessarily related to PDA, but one of my personal pet peeves in the neurodiversity community is when people will say they lack object permanence.
Mm-hmm.
You'll hear ADHD people talking about this. And they'll say, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, which really is related to working memory. It's related to executive functioning.
Sure.
But the term object permanence has a meaning.
Yes. Yes.
There is a definition there. And really, though, if you are trying to self-advocate and you go to a professional and you say, well, I think I need an ADHD diagnosis because I lack object permanence, most professionals are going to look at you and go, what are you talking about?
Sure. Or you need much more intensive neurological testing if you lack object permanence.
Right.
You know, and not to get too far off track, but it's like, you know, there are also autistic people who, on a deeper level than what's being described, like, do. Mm-hmm. Because, like, that's a glitch that can actually occur. Mm. But no, getting back to PDA, like, I absolutely deeply sympathize with the experience of seeing this label and seeing this description and having the feeling of, oh my God, this explains everything. Mm-hmm. And I fear that it just becomes like it's a circular description.
Right.
Whereas, you know, a lot of these reactions, and I talked about this at some point along with Cassiana, that, you know, I think there are a lot of different pieces to this. So it's like you still see these posters in classrooms that tell kids they're not allowed to say no, and they're not allowed to say I can't, that they're supposed to say I won't instead of I can't, or I don't want to instead of I can't. And when you are depriving kids of words to talk about their difficulties, you're not leaving them with choices other than just to say I won't. Mm-hmm. If you're not helping them drill into the deeper mechanisms behind what they find difficult and naming those things and figuring out how to work around those things, you know, you're just relentlessly demanding that they do. You know, also you still see like Yoda quoted, like there is only do, there is no try. Mm-hmm. And when you can only demand that kids do and they can't, but they're not allowed to say they can't, it's like, what are you leaving them with?
Yeah.
And then there's also a dynamic where kids with very people-pleasing temperaments will, in fact, try and try and try and try to face these demands. But when succeeding at a demand doesn't end the demand, it only escalates it. You know, one of the big misunderstandings of autism is that, like, well, if you can do this thing, then you can do this thing. If you can do this thing, you can do this thing.
Or you did that thing yesterday, so you can do it today.
Yeah. Where for us, like, none of those things are linked in the same ways. You know, a child successfully meeting a demand doesn't result in relief. It only results in escalating demand. Like, then you have created a very rational resistance to meeting adult demands.
Right.
Because you cannot know where it's ever going to end. Or it's like, you know, one of the things, again, that intrinsically autistic people have difficulty with is unpredictability. Mm-hmm. And so when meeting a demand only creates more unpredictability, you've created an incentive not to meet the demand.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and just saying, well, this is PDA, this is something that is intrinsic to this person, I think there is a serious risk of not undoing those knots, you know?
Yeah, that's such an interesting perspective. And what I hear you also saying is that it's not that you don't see how the experience of some people aligns with this, but it's more that the label moves us further away from a solution.
Yes. And, you know, some people will call this, instead of pathological demand avoidance, they'll call it pervasive demand for autonomy. Mm-hmm. Again, which I get it. And, you know, all humans have a pervasive demand for autonomy. And when you have left a human with a constricted number of choices as far as how they can achieve that autonomy, like, they're going to find counterproductive and problematic ones. Mm-hmm. So there's also an aspect of the description of PDA where some people will say that, like, kids who are able to meet certain demands will use social manipulation in order not to. And it's like, why would they be using social manipulation to avoid this thing if something about this thing were not actually deeply, deeply painful or difficult?
Right.
And the reasons why those things may be deeply painful or difficult, again, I think we mostly have the tools to explain in what we know about autism and in what we know about other neurodivergence.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is a danger in continuing to just not describe those things. And we still have an educational system that does not do a good job of giving kids words to describe their difficulties. And so, of course, when you see a label that seems to describe those difficulties but isn't getting at the deeper mechanisms, you're still just not talking about the deeper mechanisms.
Right. I want to zoom out a bit and talk about the cultural moment that we're in.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of public attention on autism lately, some of it which is very concerning. Mm-hmm. Comments from public figures and language that paints autistic people as burdens or tragedies. And so for those of us who have made a lot of effort to have affirming, respectful conversations, mm-hmm. this feels like a really big step backwards. What's your take on the public discourse right now?
Oh, God. Wow. I am not the only person I have seen say, it feels like we're in 2010 again. Mm. Like, the maddening thing is that there's a way in which this is just so unnecessary. And I don't want to say a fluke because, of course, like, the anti-vax community and, like, the autism warrior parent community got less loud over the years in certain ways, but never did go away. And so it's not like we are seeing this spring up again out of nothing. But, like, the re-election of Trump and therefore the appointment of RFK Jr. is just such a thing that didn't have to happen. And so it's really, really frustrating that it feels like over the past 15 years, we made so much progress as far as how parents and how society in general thinks about autism. And I mean, it is a little bit heartening, actually, that I see even a whole lot of non-autistic people seeing what RFK said and going, that's absurd. That's not what autism is. And also measles vaccination is good. And even parents who 15 years ago I might not have expected it from are saying things like, don't talk about our kids that way.
Yeah. And
how are our children supposed to survive if they're talked about like this? And even our children who need intensive daily support have loving, worthwhile lives and human connections.
Yes.
That's been heartening, and I guess that is a testament to how much progress we have made. And that makes it all the more infuriating that our government is determined to take us backwards this way.
It's an interesting time with all of these things. And I'm always grateful for people with voices who are advocating. Many people who we've met and connected with on various social media sites, which is one of the ways that you and I first got connected. And hopefully we'll continue this conversation.
Yeah.
Emily Paige Ballou, co-editor of Sincerely Your Autistic Child, What People on the Autism Spectrum Wish Their Parents Knew About Growing Up, Acceptance, and Identity. Thank you for all of your thoughts today.
You're so welcome.
It's easy to feel like we're doing the right thing when we talk about inclusion or use words like neurodiversity and support. But inclusion isn't the finish line. It's the starting point. If we stop at what sounds positive or empowering, we risk missing the bigger picture. Ableism doesn't always look like exclusion. Sometimes it shows up in narrow definitions of success or support that still demands conformity. This conversation reminded me that if we really want to affirm neurodivergent people, we have to ask harder questions. Whose comfort are we protecting? Whose voices are shaping the story? It's not about fixing people to fit the system. It's about rethinking the system itself. And that takes more than good intentions. It takes curiosity, courage, and a willingness to sit with the discomfort long enough to actually make change. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Our thanks again to Emily Paige Ballou. I've included links to her and her work in the show notes of this episode. Also, right here, right now is your chance to join our amazing group of educators in our very cool community called the Educator Hub. The Hub is a place where teachers and school counselors, even parents who want to learn how to better advocate for their kids, come together and share ideas on how to make the classroom a better and more welcoming place for all students, really, and a place where neurodivergent kids can thrive. The Hub is also a great place to find continuing education material, with more being added every week. There's a link in the show notes that will take you through the sign-up, and the window is open for just a little while longer, so time's a-wastin', as Grandpa would say. We'll see you in the Hub. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.